Rahul Gandhi, I am glad to say, is influencing the outlook of India. Good morning, welcome, vanakkam, suprabhatham, vande mataram. I would like to begin this video by reading a section from a blog by a gentleman called Avesh Shukla. I think he's a person from the civil service background, IAS, and he writes pretty well. I'm going to read a small section from a fairly detailed article he wrote on the Ambani wedding. Anand and Rathika, and how all the political bigwigs trooped into the unprecedented event of an event of unprecedented glitter and glory, which brought together, to the extent possible, people who mattered from all over, splashing wealth to an extent never before seen. I had made a video on a couple of videos on this, if you remember, and I'm going to read out this section to you just to assure my readers that the contents that we are generating for our YouTube Sangamam is now widely noticed by the opinion makers of India, and that therefore we are involved in something fairly significant. It will become clear as I read this text to you. For me, writes Avesh Shukla, the only ones who come out of this tamasha smelling good are the Gandhis, not one of whom attended the wedding functions, in spite of being invited personally. The absence of Rahul Gandhi particularly is not a sulking refusal or arrogant behavior, as Valsan Thampu has explained in a video. It is an affirmative action which demonstrates moral uprightness and political consistency. For this was not just a wedding, it was a political statement, a reiteration of the power and wealth of someone who controls the levers of government and wanted it to be known, not just in India, but globally. In fact, the whole article is worthy of reading. But at least I thought I would bring this much to your notice, because oftentimes we may not know the extent to which the humble efforts that we make influence people's thinking. And I think that's the greatest service to India at the present time, when thinking as a whole is discredited and people of independent thought are stigmatized as urban Naxals. Now, there is a very, very clear and compelling reason why I chose to comment on what would have been a private event. How Mukesh Ambani chooses to organize the wedding of his darling son is none of my concern, none of your concern. But since the event is by their own choice turned into a public display, doing everything possible to ensure that for days on end the attention of the country as a whole is focused on this event, in which the slavish Godi media played a very obsequious and despicable role. Every citizen in India is given the right on a platter to comment on it. A private event has to be conducted privately. You can't conduct a private event as a public event and then say that the citizens of the country have no right to comment on it. I clarify this because the camp followers of the Ambani empire as well as the stormtroopers of the BJP, they have become virtually one in this event. They have been raising questions about the two videos I have shared with you, saying, what business do I have to comment on an event which is entirely up to Sri Mukesh Ambani to decide which way and how to organize? Yes, I agree with you up to a point. I agree with you with those who argue like this to the extent that it's an Ambani event. But the Ambani event has been made a national event. And that confers on anyone, not only myself, anyone, the right to think freely, independently. Now, if the idea is that citizens of this country are now obliged, because of the tremendous and irresistible economic might of the Ambanis, we are obliged to think only as the Ambanis think, then there is a problem. I'm sorry, I won't be able to agree with it. But in light of the reactions from my detractors, I feel obliged to offer two clarifications. And I'm sure these clarifications are of great and direct interest to all my viewers, because by now I've developed a healthy respect for each of you. At least a vast majority of you, 99.9% of you. The 0.1% would be the detractors. 99.99% of you are well-meaning people who think objectively, who do not want to sell their souls to any camp, but who feel that as self-respecting people we need to preserve and cherish our dignity as thinking individuals who are committed to truth, justice and fair play in public life. There are two important reasons why I thought, in fact I felt it incumbent on me, imperative for me to take note of this event and to make my thinking known in the public space. The first is a cultural issue. Some of you would know that I'm someone who takes a lot of interest in culture studies. Culture studies, how cultures behave, what are the operative paradigms in cultures, what are the priorities that operate in cultures, how does a culture move, what are the dynamics that play in this process, and what are the various ingredients in culture, how do they mix and mingle, so on and so forth. A whole host of questions keep me continually engaged. So I have an academic interest in culture studies, and therefore I look at all events of public notice also from the angle of culture studies. And this Ambani wedding event is a tremendous and irresistible object from the perspective of culture studies. Now let me explain what I mean. From the perspective of culture studies, this is not just a private wedding. This is also a very major mega interference in cultural dynamics. Let me explain what I mean. In this context, perhaps I should refer you to a book that was published more than 120 years ago. The name of the author is Thorstein Veblen. The name is a bit awkward, but Veblen is easy to remember. Veblen. Veblen. He is an economist, but he also, as economists used to 100 years ago, write on an assortment of topics, as Amartya Sen, for example, does. Most of the economists of our times narrow down their range of concerns only to things that seem to be purely belonging to the domain of economics. If you look at Karl Marx, he has such an encyclopedic mind. You look at Adam Smith, exactly the same. And down to Amartya Sen, you find this kind of encyclopedic, eclectic and cosmic outlook. And I believe that economics will sink or become poorer as a discipline to the extent that this broader perspective is renounced and economists narrow down their vision only to what they consider to be purely economics oriented subjects or concerns. Now, let me very briefly indicate a very important insight that Thorstein Veblen provides in that book. The title of the book I have not mentioned yet, now let me mention, that is Theory of the Leisure Class. It's a very interesting title, Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen. I am giving this detail so that you can readily access this book, a book worth reading. You can get it free from the net. Now, an important idea that Veblen shares with us here is that what he calls the leisure class are the socio-economic elite. They are leisure class because they don't have to work. They don't have to break sweat on their body to lead a life of stinging affluence. They are actually parasites according to Veblen, and they thrive on the hard labor of others, a theme that Karl Marx argued in great detail, a theory of the expropriation of alienation of value, surplus value, which is alienation of the value of the work done by the working class, and the misappropriation of that by the capitalists to constitute capital for further expansion. So, theory of surplus value results when the products of the workers' effort are commoditized, and commodity always carries the implication of profit, and the profit goes into the kitty of the capitalist, who continues to swell, and the working class, who work to their fingers to their bones, do not get due compensation for the hard work they put in. Therefore, there is no amelioration of the misery that they have to live in. And a classic study of this, if you are interested, a classic study of this is Engels' work titled The Middle Class in 1844. The Middle Class in 1844. I have not read a book better than this, Engels' the English Middle Class, 1844, that brings home to us the extent to which the working class has been exploited and actually still is being exploited, because that is not the main subject of our concern here. I am not going to dive this too much into Marx and Engels. By the way, I am not a Marxian, I am not a communist, I am a free thinker. A free thinker cannot align himself to any particular school of thought, because by belonging to a school of thought, you compromise your freedom to think freely. Now, what Veblen says is that the members of the leisure class, they are in every society a very tiny set of people. Now, these days we are being repeatedly told that the top 1% of India's population, the rich, the glitterati, they own 40% of our national wealth. The top 1% own 40% of our national wealth. So, you can imagine how alarming the economic imbalance in our country is. And all that's at the back of my mind when I react to emerging situations, including the Ambani wedding. Now, Veblen says that it is in the interest of the leisure class to create a sense of economic and cultural underprivilege in the population. It's a very interesting argument. In order to push up the sale of their products, in order to enlarge the taste for their products and thereby enlarge also the markets for their products, the leisure class has to show off their wealth in public, display it in lurid details in public, so as to artificially create the sense of underprivilege in the general population. How does that happen? Now, when you see an Ambani wedding or an Adani wedding or a Tata Birla wedding, Tata of course is out of the question because the family is virtually dying out. When such elite weddings are organized in this kind of massive public attention, the whole country is focused, and without their knowing it, the people, especially from the middle class upwards, they will begin to ask themselves, now what is it that we are doing? We are doing a great disservice to our sons and daughters. We are not organized in their weddings, so the kind of glory, the kind of augustness, the kind of public attention and display, what's called the invidious display, that is, display that will create a sense of disenchantment, frustration and self-revulsion in the minds of the lower class of people. So, everybody looks up to this event, and suddenly, without knowing it, our cultural standards go up. So, now you can watch, for example, weddings to be organized in the households of important people, rich people, will now register an upgradation in terms of consumption and the expenditure of money and the public display and the range of coverage, etc., from this moment onwards. So, what this Ambani wedding is doing is not merely getting a son married to a daughter, it's also making a serious interference with the Indian culture, so that the consumerist orientation already developed to an unhealthy extent, this insalubrious, unhealthy, excessive consumerist orientation of the Indian culture, which now sits uncomfortably on a spiritual culture, the Indian spiritual culture which is famous throughout the world, this consumerist expansion, this consumerist blowing up, as it were, is further enlarged, further intensified, further broadened to engulf more and more people, so that within a very short span of time, the 3,000, 4,000 or 5,000, as the case may be, of the crores of rupees that was spent on this wedding by Mukesh Ambani and the family, that will be recovered. Before you have time to realize, Mukesh Ambani would have recovered. In fact, he has already recovered this mega investment in conducting this most envious wedding of the century. He will not suffer a rupee loss. Rather, he will stand to gain thousands of crores of rupees through this wedding. That's my analysis. And I didn't want to say this, but having waited so far and realized that nobody is picking on this, the cultural side of it, I'm not an economist, I'm a student of culture studies. So from my perspective, this is a very powerful, purposive, deliberate, mega interference with the texture, the fiber, the tapestry of Indian culture, in order to aggravate, accentuate and broad base the consumerist spirit of Indian culture. And the consequences you will see in a very, very short span of time if you really follow up on this. That's point number one. Point number two, which to me is even more important, and this, I don't think Sri Rahul Gandhi was particularly concerned about this. So this is my concern, but now let me say why I appreciated Rahul Gandhi. And I have been caricatured as somebody who is an admirer of Rahul Gandhi. By now you should know that I am nobody's admirer. I evaluate people on principle in terms of what they stand for, not merely by what they say, but what they do. And I respect people only when their actions match their words. That's called personal authenticity, integrity and probity. And I can respect a person only if his actions match his words. Now suppose a person X, Y or Z is the Prime Minister of India or the President of the United States of America. He contradicts with what he does, what he has already said by his words, then I'll have zero respect for him. That's where I stand, I can't help it. I'm sure most of you are like that. Now Rahul Gandhi could not have gone there, and I dare say none of the leaders of the opposition camp, the India camp, could have gone there if they had the slightest conscience and consistency of thought. Why? That's precisely what I want to share with you. You remember many of them took the oath when they were sworn in, holding a copy of the Indian Constitution. And I am amazed, I am aghast that these political worthies did not know that by going to the Ambani wedding, they were actually violating the spirit of the Indian Constitution. Only one person knew it. Thank God for it. At least one person knew it, and his name is Rahul Gandhi. Small wonder that even a person like Bharat Ratna Amartya Sen today comes out publicly acknowledging the maturity and soundness of thought of Sri Rahul Gandhi. I am nobody compared to Amartya Sen, right? So now let me tell you where attending this wedding actually flouts the very spirit of the Indian Constitution. As even a school kid knows that in the Indian Constitution there is a section called Directive Principles of State Policy. Now, the ingredients of the Directive Principles of State Policy are not justiciable. That is to say, if any of those principles are violated, the grievance resulting from it cannot be litigated in a court of law. There is no legal remedy. If the state goes against it, or the state keeps it in suspended animation and doesn't act on it, nobody can go to a court of law and seek redressal for it. In other words, no grievance can be generated on the basis of neglecting the ingredients in the Directive Principles of State Policy. But I want to read out Section 2 of Article 38 of the Indian Constitution. I am reading only the Indian Constitution, a copy of which was held out by all these people who went to this wedding. They do not know the substance of the Constitution which they claim they protect or they want to protect. This is utter hypocrisy. There is no consistency, there is no integrity, there is no truth in it, and that will become very evident as I read. I am not going to offer any comment, I am just going to read the text of the 38th article of the Indian Constitution. The state, I am reading from section 2 onwards. The state shall in particular strive to minimize the inequalities in income and endeavor to eliminate inequalities in status, facilities and opportunities, not only amongst individuals but also amongst groups of people residing in different areas or engaged in different vocations. So, in economic inequality, which is clearly on display in this kind of stinkingly rich, lavish, wasteful organization of a wedding between a man and a woman, which mocks the 80 crore abjectly poor citizens of India who have to line up to get the 5 kilo ration from the government so that they don't die of starvation. It is a public display of contempt towards these people who should come within the ambit of the Directive Principles of State Policy. And then let me also read Article 39. I read Article 38, sub-article 2 a while ago. Now I am going to read the 4 or 5 provisions of Article 39 of the Indian Constitution. The state shall in particular direct its policy towards securing A, that the citizens, men and women, equally have the right to an adequate means of livelihood. Is the state doing it? I leave it to you. B, that the ownership and control of the material resources of the community are so distributed as best to subserve the common good. No comment is required. C, that the operation of the economic system does not result in the concentration of wealth and means of production in the common means of production to the common detriment. I want to read that section again because it is so central to our theme. That the operation of the economic system, the state has to ensure that the operation of the economic system does not result in the concentration of wealth and means of production to the common detriment. In other words, the framers of the Indian Constitution knew, they were wise enough, they knew that if wealth concentrated in the hands of a few people, the whole economic system will automatically work to the detriment of the large sections of India's citizenship or India's people. All right. D, sub-article 4, that there is equal pay for work for both men and women. And maybe I should stop there. So, my dear friends, how can you flaunt a copy of the Constitution and create the impression in public that you are committed to the letter and spirit of the Indian Constitution? Because that's what it means when you say that you want to defend the Constitution of India. How do you defend the Constitution in India except by living by its values, norms, principles and ideals? by giving effect to its prescriptions and directives, by respecting its fundamental values. How do you defend the Constitution? Simply by waving a copy of the Constitution in the air? What nonsense is it? So in my mind, the leaders of the opposition parties, including Mamata Banerjee, have discredited themselves in public by doing this. They can always offer the alibi or the excuse that they are not aware of the directive principles of state policy. But ignorance of the Constitution is not a defense, it's an insult. If you are in public life, and particularly if you are in politics, and you are leaders of various political parties and you have been in government, you have no excuse for being ignorant about the most basic elements in the Indian Constitution, the directive principles of state policy. They have not been made justiciable because the framers of the Indian Constitution were considerate enough to realize that they were framing a constitution for a fledgling nation, and therefore all these ideals cannot be realized overnight. Let the various statements in their own fashion, in a slow degree, address these desirable goals. They are not superfluous, they are not to be dispensed with, they are not to be neglected. They are desirable goals, they have to be realized, if not today, tomorrow, if not tomorrow, the day after. They cannot be kept in a state of permanent abeyance. So, you cannot really pretend that you don't know these things. Holding aloft a copy of the Constitution is nothing if in the very next moment you go and lend your support to something that exists on the ground which flouts the very spirit of the Constitution. I give full credit to Sri Rahul Gandhi for being consistent. This is the reason why I say that even if I have no political interest, I have to appreciate certain things, because, my dear friends, the only method left to you and me to promote and reinforce what is good, beautiful, true and just in our public life is by acclaiming what is right and disclaiming what is wrong and what is bogus, spurious, specious, dishonest and deceptive. And doing so is integral to believing in the motto of the nation, Satyameva Jayate Nanardam. And that motto also enjoins on all citizens to be truthful. And truth requires, as I have been saying, consistency between what we say and the stand we take in public and what we actually do. That integrity, I am sad to say, is now conspicuously absent as regards a vast majority of political leaders. And that consistency, I am glad to say, is found, thank God, at least in one political leader, Sri Rahul Gandhi. Are you surprised, therefore, that I take note of the national significance and the tremendous inspiring impact of Rahul Gandhi's heroic decision, significant decision, shall I say spiritual decision, not to lend his personal authority to an event that is organized, flying in the face of the Indian Constitution, in particular the directive principles of state policy. Rahul Gandhi, by not going to the event, has authenticated, that's the word to be used, has authenticated his commitment not merely to the letter of the Indian Constitution, but also to the spirit of the Indian Constitution. And it augurs well that we have a leader who shapes, trims, if you like, his public conduct, not merely in light of the fundamental rights and prescriptions in the Constitution, but also in light of the directive principles of state policy, which, as I have said, is not justiciable. The courts cannot enforce on it. Therefore, even if these principles are violated 1,000 times, no legal consequences follow. And therefore, the determination on the part of Rahul Gandhi to stay faithful to this, even when there is no consequence, makes that decision even more laudable and adorable. That's precisely where I stand. Once again, I want to thank everyone for being part of this journey where, without fear and favor, we look at events in public life so as to identify the heart of its meaning and the substance of its truths. And I believe that at this point in time, this is the bare minimum patriotism that we need to practice. Jai Hind.